All right, welcome everybody, all of you geeks. We're going to be UFO geeking some more. This is Alejandro Rojas. I'm the UFO expert at Den of Geek, and we've been doing these live streams talking about different UFO topics, mostly because there was a big surge of UFO news just a few weeks ago when the Department of Defense sent out a memo saying that these UFO videos that had been in the news actually for 2 or 3 years. It started with a New York Times article back in 2017 that they're actually real. They are considered unidentified by the Navy. They were captured by these F-18 jets. Of course, we've had some people on recently to talk all about the details of that case, and you can check out those live streams right here on Den of Geeks YouTube or Facebook page. You can see those previous videos. But today we're going to talk about a different aspect of it. And that is that it's sort of funny and not a lot of people know it because not a lot of people cover, or not a lot of the news outlets cover it. But all of this really came about because of a rock star, Tom DeLonge. I mean, he really... he started telling people he was working with people in the government years ago. Most people kind of rolled their eyes. Then WikiLeaks came out, John Podesta's emails. This is the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton. And there were conversations with Tom DeLonge and talking about meeting with these high-level officials. So people started taking him seriously, at least some of us UFO geeks. And then eventually he started this To the Stars group, and that group included Luis Elizondo, a guy who claimed to work at the Pentagon on a UFO project. Soon after that, the New York Times wrote their story detailing this project, and the rest is history. But we're going to talk about this with a guy who has a blog about UFOs called Punk Rock and UFOs. This is Mike Damante. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me. It's always great talking to you again. So thanks for having me on that way.
My pleasure. So you're a journalist that covers a lot of different topics. What sort of topics? Because I guess punk rock is one of the things that you wrote about. That's why you have the name.
Yeah, so previously I used to work for Hearst Media, Houston Chronicle, for about 7 years. I worked basically on the copy desk doing copy editing, web producing, and I also did writing too. I did some stuff in sports and features because I was always into music, and basically, they were covering a lot of, mainstream artists, but they really wouldn't cover some of the punk rock and emo stuff that I grew up. So whenever like a band would, come to town that I like, like Bad Religion or like the bands that played Warped Tour, I would always like cover that for them. And obviously, before that, I was a fan of, the music my whole life. When I was in college, I was working for the school newspaper. I would cover that music. And, so yeah, that's what kind of was my background in journalism. So I take those fundamentals and I apply them to kind of what I do now with UFO research. But in my in my coverage of music through the years, I mean, obviously I've covered, Tom DeLonge's career because I'm a huge Blink-182 fan. I was a fan of Blink even before I started doing music journalism. So it's interesting because a lot of these things that come up now regarding Tom and like his interests, it's like the stuff that Blink fans have known about for like years. And some of the people new to it, like in UFOs, are kind of like, oh wow, he said that, he was into that, and it's like, yeah. But yeah, so that's kind of my background, and now I have the website punkrockandufos.com. I have 2 books written about the subject, soon to be 3. The third one comes out next week, and I just like to continue using this as another outlet to write and cover a topic that I'm passionate about, which is UFOs and unexplained.
Mm-hmm. Now you're also a teacher, right?
Correct. Yeah, I teach journalism, creative writing, English. That's what I currently do for a living. I do a music blog on the side for the Chronicle. That's just for fun.
Cool. And then what age group do you teach?
I teach high school, so it's most of my classes are electives, so it's all different grades. But I've taught sophomore and senior English, and it's interesting because like when the kids find out that I'm into this stuff, they're interested too. So it's really cool to see like the younger kids who have an interest in this topic. Like, most of them are like, absolutely, it's real. Like, it's really cool just to see the younger generation take interest in the topic and believe.
Yeah. I think it's funny. It's cool that you're a teacher too, and you've got this rocker kind of side to you, and you have all those tattoos and everything, but you're kind of like me. You're one of these guys that no matter how you try, everybody sees through it, that you're actually a nice guy.
Yeah.
And, you've got that perma nice guy, which is kind of a good combination.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
But getting into the topic. So it's kind of funny that you started up this website called Punk Rock and UFOs. And I'm assuming you had no idea that, Tom DeLonge was working on this stuff in the background, or at least you might have had an idea of that, but that it would blow up and be such a big thing like it is now.
Yeah, I think when I wrote the first book, To the Stars Academy wasn't a thing yet. When I wrote my first one, it was Punk Rock and UFOs, Cryptozoology Meets Anarchy. To the Stars was around, but not the Academy. And I'm not even sure. I mean, the second book, obviously, the Academy was just starting. But when I started the website was just an extension of my first book, just so I can continue to write, because I didn't know if I was ever going to write another book or have somebody want to put out another one. So I just wanted to continue it online. So yeah, I think I had no idea that, To Stars Academy was going to be a thing. And then once it was announced and launched, I mean, obviously other people, it's brought in a lot of new people to the field too. Like I'm been doing this stuff for about, I think, 5 or 6 years. I still consider myself relatively new, quote unquote, with still a lot of things to learn. But it's just cool to see, like, it's kind of like, I could harken it back to music. Like when a band comes out and people never heard them for the first time, and it brings in a whole new group of fans, not just to that band, to that genre. I think, we kind of see that now with UFO stuff, not just with To the Stars, but just in general, with, the shows on TV, like Project Blue Book or Unidentified, or even like something like Ancient Aliens. A kid watches that show and, maybe they're hooked and maybe they want to pick up a book and start reading. So I think it's cool that there's a lot more mainstream attention kind of to the topic that's just going to bring in more people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love that more journalists like yourself and others have been getting involved. In fact, we'll talk about one of those in a second. But just for some background, I want to let some people know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. To the Stars, Tom started like a long time ago, where I think around 2009-ish. And that's where he had his new band, Angels and Airwaves, and some other media type stuff he started working on. And To the Stars Academy started in 2017. The difference being that the Academy had a lot of ex-intelligence people coming together to start this company to really seriously investigate UFOs, including this Lou Elizondo who worked at this Pentagon program, AATIP. So TTSA refers to the Stars, which is that group of intelligence and scientists and such working on the UFO issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when that announcement hit right away, I think a lot of us were interested from the start, just because obviously the people who was assembled to be on To the Stars Academy, I mean, they're all legit. As a journalist, a lot of times, we trust official titles. Now, that doesn't mean people with the official title is always trustworthy, but that title lends to credibility. So as a journalist, when you look at everyone who started To the Stars Academy, all those people are credible by their titles alone. So I think that's the reason why a lot of us got, our interest got piqued even more. Like, okay, let's see where this goes from here.
Mm-hmm. Now, with Tom DeLonge and To the Stars, do you think that there's kind of this difference? I mean, you've been really involved with kind of this hashtag UFO Twitter, or, a lot of people who are on Twitter hashtagging UFO information. You share your blogs there, and both of us have been, getting in there and conversing with those people. But it's kind of interesting that there's this, a lot of UFO community groups they really get like activist groups and especially activists for disclosure and alien or UFO, that aliens are communicating with the government or some of these other kind of more fringe ideas. But inside To the Stars, at least Lou Elizondo's told me in interviews and kind of expressed that this was kind of disclosure. He came out and said, hey, we were investigating UFOs. Look at these great cases. They're a real thing and we take it seriously. And that's what he was able to disclose. But there's a lot of people still out there asking for more. We've got a good friend, Bryce Zabel. I think it reminds me, you retweeted something of his this morning where he's still asking for disclosure. It's kind of this weird dichotomy, I think. And I know you've written about social media. I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, did disclosure happen? Is there more disclosure? Do you see kind of a genuine goal that's obtainable by these people who are kind of more like activists?
Yeah, so it's weird because it's like I feel like there's like two sides to it, right? Like for some people, it'll never be enough, no matter what we get, no matter what the outlet is, whether it's the New York Times, or whether it's to the Stars Academy, whether it's Washington Post, whether it's whatever. It's never going to be enough. Someone had a really good point. I think I forgot who it was, but said this is the disclosure. This is it. The Pentagon coming out admitting that yes, these videos are real. We facilitated this, and you would think on the surface that should, for some, be enough because that's huge. But there's obviously still in the community who are just wanting more, or they don't think it's enough, or they're like, oh, that's it. And it almost sounds ungrateful. And it's like, it's to the point where, like I said, there's two sides to it. Obviously, there's, UFO Twitter or whatever, like they're really active with trying to push, for more, which is great. But at the same time, it's like, there's only so much I think we can get at once or in general, and if that's what, I think people really kind of gloss over how important everything that's happened in the past couple of years is, because it's kind of unprecedented in a sense. So it's, I think there's like two sides to it. It's like you can't please everyone, and there are people who are gonna, they're gonna hate on everything To the Stars does, regardless of whether how big it is or what comes out. They're gonna say, oh well, what about this, or can we have this? So there's two sides to it, and it's frustrating, for us because we see the news value in it and we see the importance of it, and it sucks that it gets diluted by a few not bad apples, but a few sour grapes on Twitter.
It's funny because we're both in that area, kind of straddling the journalism, where journalists are inherently skeptic, and then of course we mingle with the UFO Twitter and stuff, which are can often tend towards the fringe. And like you said, we see the news value. So to journalists and in journalism, it's been pretty big deal. You've probably heard this, especially from your skeptical fellow journalists who give you trouble. I mean, not all of my scientific journalists give me trouble, but some of them really do. And so this is such a huge deal in the mainstream media that, finally it's okay to talk about UFOs. Navy saying there are unidentified objects. And at the same time, like you said, there's a lot of people who this isn't enough. But at the same time, in their defense, To the Stars is kind of like this, because although the group, those credible people you're talking about, are conservative, and they're like, hey, this is a big deal. We just broke the story. And in the background, which we'll get into, there's more going on there. But you also have Tom DeLonge, who is kind of in the UFO alien activism part, where he's kind of espoused some pretty off the wall kind of ideas. And it seems like he's wanting more.
So two things. I want to cover two things you said, which are really good. So as journalists, intrinsically, we're meant to question everything, right? So you take that mindset in general. Then you also look at the UFO community, who's overly skeptical as it is. So it's almost like you're getting it double, where nothing is believable now. So it's like the skepticism is like amplified, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's doubled now because, like I said, you have a group of people who are skeptical from the start. Andrew, you still there?
Yeah.
Okay. So you get a group of people who are skeptical from the start, and then you start pushing these topics which we once considered fringe, or these stories are coming out that sound unbelievable to the average person. But like the people who are doing these stories are legit journalists. Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Kean, these are people I've interviewed before, and they work for one of the largest outlets, in the world. Whether you like the product or not, the steps that they do are legit. They vetted Lou Elizondo before they decided to run the story. So it's like, these are people putting their professional journalists working for one of the biggest outlets in the world, putting their reputation on the line. The other side of that, I want you mentioned Tom DeLonge, who said some things that may kind of go against the other people on his on the To the Stars Academy, which may disagree with. So I mean, Tom. I've interacted with Tom quite a few times in my life. I've met him a bunch of times. I've interviewed him before back in the day when I worked for music outlets, and people who just see him as this rich rock star, they don't understand how he operates. He has hyped up everything he's ever done in his career, his music, his projects, and that's just how he is. He's trying to sell what he's doing, and he's passionate about it. and that doesn't mean, he's not to be trusted, or he's writing checks, his butt can't cash or anything. He's just passionate about what he does, and he speaks on it. So I think for people in the UFO community who are unfamiliar with him and his background and how he's been his whole career, they may say, "Oh, who is this charlatan trying to sell this?" And I remember when To the Stars first launched, there's some people on Twitter saying that Tom DeLonge was doing this to sell T-shirts, and I'm like, are you aware how much money he's worth? Like, and he left one of the largest bands in the world, where he's getting paid, millions of dollars just to tour. He left all that behind to research this. So this is obviously something he's passionate about.
Right. There's a lot of people in the chat kind of debating some of this, and I'll get to those questions, but I want to ask a couple more first. But I want to get into like your last blog, which was about social media and this topic, which also adds to, I think, some of the confusion that goes on. Some of the confusion. What's interesting about this confusion, though, is that the mainstream media seems to be way less confused than the average UFO researcher. And what I mean by that is kind of been the theme of these interviews, especially the last one I did with Tim McMillan, where he's talking with the DoD, and they've been really sending out a lot of mixed messages regarding all of this. And your article kind of highlighted some quotes from Tim where he's gotten some responses from them that just don't seem legit. Like they're just somehow changing their messaging and a lot of denying some of the things that Elizondo had said, despite him having proof and all firsthand witnesses agreeing with him. And then, I guess, what do you make of this? What do you make of all of this weird messaging coming out of the DoD?
Well, it's weird because like Lou warned us of this. He said right from the start, there's people who aren't happy with me and don't want this out. And at first, like the fact that the messaging was weird or a little conflicting, I looked at it this way. This is something me and you talked about, and I think a lot of people in the UFO community miss this because this is a common sense argument. So I'm a teacher. I work at a school, right? There's 300 other teachers there, or a staff, right? You can ask another staff member, "Hey, do you know Mike Damante?" "Sure, yeah, I know who he is." "Do you know what he does?" Not everyone can tell you that. Now imagine working in the Pentagon, especially a program that was was a secret program. So not everyone's going to know what you did there. So it's obvious how that can get lost in translation, number one. And number two, like I said, Lou warned about it, that people weren't happy about him. So obviously people were going to maybe send the mixed messaging to try to muddy the waters a little bit. But from the start, people like you and people like me, like, we took at face value that he was who he said he was. Because if he wasn't, I think it'd be a lot worse. You'd have a lot more writing to be lying about it. So I think like I said, some of us took him at face value from the start, and we, I think from then, there's other people who, spent years trying to tear him down and find out otherwise, and it's they've been proven wrong. He is who he says he is, and obviously the messaging has been mixed, but this is something I mentioned in the last article, that a lot of the people on UFO Twitter were pushing for that UFO advocacy of more disclosure, getting more straight answers from the Pentagon, and especially the spokespeople. One of the things I mentioned in the article is like, look no further than Susan Gao's background. She's specifically there to kind of manage messages. So this is the message that they want out there, that let's put some doubt that he is who he says he is, then it's working, because there's all this division in the UFO community about it. But you're right, it's like a lot of mainstream outlets, I mean, they've reported on it, but not as much as the UFO community dives into that aspect.
Yeah, it seems like with mainstream media, and this is, I guess, what people don't get so much, is that they're not in the government's back pocket by any means. They're still critical and cynical and skeptical, if not more skeptical than of the government responses than anybody else, because the government, unfortunately, especially the military and the DoD, is definitely spins fairly heavily at times when they're sending out their messages, and that's something journalists know. And Lou had behind him all of the firsthand people, Harry Reid, some of the people like Chris Mellon, high profile people who are part of To the Stars, who are putting their their reputation on the line, who wouldn't work with some guy who's a liar if they had already vetted him.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, people like us, we have journalism backgrounds, so we understand sometimes how public relations works too. Public relations is based very similar to journalism. So in terms of getting the message out, you have professional people doing it at the high level for the Pentagon. They're definitely going to, if they want to mix up a message, they can do it easily. And I think it's easier for the common person not to necessarily fall for it, but to kind of, not understand the messaging. So I think that's, definitely muddying the waters is something that they may be actively trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Nick Pope, who worked for the UK government looking into UFOs and did the same thing, called it spin and dirty tricks, where when the media calls, you just give them a goofy line, even if it's something you really think is credible. You don't want the media sniffing around. You just give them a reason to make fun of it, and so they can disregard it, and they'll run with that.
Yeah.
Although it does seem in this case that the media hasn't taken the bait, even though some UFO researchers have. The media hasn't taken the bait with their mixed messaging, and that this story seems to have be bigger and have a lot more legs than the DoD seemed to expect.
Yeah, especially when I think they strategically announced it during COVID because they thought it was going to be buried, and surprisingly, it didn't. It was a huge story. So I thought that was really fascinating. How the time they released it, I think, was absolutely strategic, and it kind of backfired on them. In one of the busiest possible times in the news cycle to kind of get something out there, and it became a big story that day. I think it was number one on quite a few of the larger sites in terms of clicks and hits.
Back to the Rockstar aspect before we get into getting some questions. I mean, what's it like for you, especially that being one of your major passions, and knowing, having interviewed Tom DeLonge and followed Blink 182. Blink 182, of course, definitely not a band that is regarded as like some kind of serious, deep thought. It's more like fun, let's go party on the beach, skater kind of stuff. That this would be the source or the main impetus for the release of probably the biggest news on this topic and the biggest, change of paradigm on this topic in this country for decades.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like all it really takes. I mean, I think that shows a lot of us, people who investigate this stuff. That all it takes is really one person with the right time, the right connections, and the right profile, I guess, to kind of get their foot in the door like he did. A lot of these politicians, they heard of Blink-182 from their kids and grandkids. So, for them, oh, hey, the guy from Blink-182 wants to talk about, education. Because at first, that's how DeLonge kind of framed it. He wants to educate kids about science and space. Then he was able to kind of use that to slip the UFO topic too. And I mean, it all takes is, obviously for people like us, we don't have that profile. We don't have the resources that he does. But I think that's an example of somebody using their quote unquote celebrity to do good, or, to attempt to do something kind of greater than, what they're previously doing. Not to take away from anything he's done previously, but I think what he's doing now, I mean, there's just so many moving parts to it, which I think all add to it. I think, with the Secret Machines books and all the other projects that To the Stars has out right now, I think it's all part of a big puzzle, and I think it's just fascinating to kind of see where it goes or how big it can go. I mean, it's still a very small company. I think a lot of people don't understand how small they actually are, despite the high profile people working for them.
Right. Yeah. That it's only just a handful of people trying to do quite a lot and trying to become a viable company, which may or may not happen. I mean, their future is certainly not set in stone, that they're still kind of in those startup stages where they're trying to make this something that can stand on its own 2 feet and last for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get into some of these questions. I think there are some great questions here. This is one from Brian Drummond. He said, the fact that AATIP existed all this time, AATIP is Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the Pentagon UFO project, which started back in like 2007, and we only heard about it, in 2017. But he says the fact that AATIP existed all this time while simultaneously the military government's official stance has always been nothing to see, we don't study UFOs, no national security threat, is one of the many things that points to the fact that they're keeping a vast majority of data to themselves, which is a great point because, you know, I've tried to get data from the government on many, many occasions. And often, I would say maybe 90% of the time, they just give you this UFO fact sheet that says, since we closed Blue Book in 1969, we don't really care about this topic. We don't look into it. Go somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what we talked about earlier with the mixed messaging you get sometimes, you know? It's a great question because it's like, it's either nothing to see here, you know, we don't study UFOs, but obviously we know otherwise. And for us, you know, we've known this for a long time before, you know, we even heard that AATIP, you know, existed and there's all these secret aspects programs. We knew they existed for years. We just got official confirmation of it. So it's interesting, you know, that we finally kind of got that aha, like, you know, we could tell our friends, see, we weren't lying. These programs are legit and they've been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And he does make a good point there because, you know, like we talked about before, we've got kind of on the Elizondo side, he's kind of saying, this is disclosure. You've gotten it. This was disclosure. There's a few more things out there that we're trying to pry out of the hands of the people who have it, but you've gotten the gist of what's out there. Then you have Tom who's like, you know, oh, we're got maybe a space war with aliens going on. So this huge kind of, and people are saying, well, if we didn't know about AATIP for many years, and now we do, and like this argument, how much more is there? Is it more along the Lou Elizondo's line where there's not a whole lot, there's more, but not, you know, a whole lot? Or is there a major secrets going on where we've only just seen the tip of the iceberg? What do you think?
I think there's a lot more that's slowly being fed out. And I think cleverly they place some of these things in their some of their other projects. Like if you read the Secret Machines books, even the fictionalized ones too, there's stuff in there that I was shocked that even though it is a fictionalized book that they included, just considering you know what the overall messaging is. So I think there's a lot more that's coming. It's only I think you know what they're allowed to say. I think I was watching an interview with Tom recently where you know he said every once in a while he'll say something to Lou and Lou will look at him like, how do you know that? So I think they're allowed to only say so much. You know, when To the Stars first came out, the Academy, remember they posted these mock-ups of like these spaceships that they were going to try to do, and obviously that's you know that's them saying, hey, we would like to do this one day, but you know people jumped on it like, oh, they're going to build, they're an aerospace company, they're going to do this and that. But I think that was just kind of wishful thinking. You know, these are things we could potentially do. So I think little teases like that they've been kind of doing the whole time.
Yeah. There's some people who think this is kind of a part of a government project to release more information. I mean, how much more, what do you think they know? How much more, how big does it get? Do you think they've had meetings with aliens type of thing or have a crashed, you know, spacecraft from somewhere else?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I like to go back to the book, the Day After Roswell by Phil Corso. I'm a big fan of the book. I know some people don't buy his story, but I think it's a good start in terms of looking at.
Maybe in a nutshell, let people know what Corso claimed.
So Corso claimed that he worked on the reverse. So his job was to take the UFO crash material from Roswell and then sell it to private companies to then try to reverse engineer it. And the book basically attributes the technology boom we had, I think, in that time period to that. Things like fiber optics and I think what else in there? Laser discs and a bunch of other innovations. So I think, you know,
Teflon, I think.
Yeah. So I think you kind of go back there and you say, hey, look, you know, this isn't the idea that potentially governments have been, you know, working behind the scenes with foreign tech. I mean, this isn't a new idea. This has been floated around for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So that was a good one. Here's another one, and this is a journalism-based one. The reason why people want more disclosure is because the media have not picked up the ball and run with it. Why aren't hard questions being asked of the government? And I'm always curious what people expect the media to do. I mean, what do you think?
It's hard because, like, think about access for a minute, right? How many journalists get access to the White House? and you're in, with everything going on right now. Like I said, we've had unprecedented past, in America, these past, almost 4 years have been unprecedented with everything that's going on, all the craziness in the country and in the world. So I think it's, every once in a while you'll see someone try to slip in a UFO question, but it's like, do you want to be that guy? To ask about UFOs when the rest of the world's burning. So I think that's part of it on their end. But I think they have to pull aside. I think they need to like target specific people and try to pull them aside and interview them rather doing something at a news conference. Do the work, find the people in the government who have been briefed, and then try to get them to speak more on record. I think that's I think that's what they need to do.
I think the other thing too is with what people forget with journalism is we can't like write a story and make an accusation that we can't support. Yeah. Whereas, of course, that's the majority of what UFO research has been for a long time. Is a lot of accusations and speculation. And so, for instance, you're familiar with this Wilson document. So I think it's real notes from a researcher who now has been involved with To the Stars actually and done some of the work. Dr. Eric Davis. And he has not confirmed these are real, but that these notes that he went to meet with this admiral and these other people, and essentially the story was that there was a UFO project, but they might have even obtained some stuff, but Hugh didn't have the right to know about it. And people have really been pushing this. And somebody asked me and was critical of the media, why doesn't the media cover this? But, I would ask you, because I know you know about this topic. It's big on UFO Twitter and everything. My response is there's nothing there. There's an alleged document of an alleged conversation. The people in the conversation on the record, the guy who wrote the notes won't go on the record. So how can you write anything if you don't have anything substantial to substantiate it?
Yeah, they would basically be writing off stuff that's already been reported. Hey, these documents exist. No one's going on record. The end. Like that's it for now until you get people on record to. I think who was it? Stephen Greenstreet's show with the New York Post that they do, and he asked Davis multiple times, and he wouldn't bite on anything. Making any comments on the record, and he says he couldn't comment, and that in itself, you may say something, but. It's hard to pitch a story like that to a big outlet without having anyone talking. I think you could, but once again, the only thing you would get from that is maybe having more eyes on the story, but it wouldn't really advance the story much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the extent of my coverage of that story. Was essentially I did ask Davis. He said I can't speak to that. Which to me said something. And so I tweeted his response, and that was it. One tweet, because what more can you do? And even if he did go on the record, it's one guy of alleging all of this stuff. So, which people who know Dr. Davis and know he's credible, which I think he is, I don't think he's a liar at all. I think if he said he had that conversation, he really did. But still, if you can't really prove it or get anybody else on the record or any corroborating witnesses to any of that going on, at least for mainstream, there's not really much you can do. But what can't? Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, what can they do though? What is media not doing that they could do?
I think follow up more. I think there's been big gaps between the New York Times stories, but they've all been big stories, and a lot of that it's like an editorial decision. The reporters can want to do as much as they want, but if the editors say no, we'll pass. But I think, if you think about it, we're in the golden age of UFO news in terms of how it's coverage and how it looked. And one of the things I tell people, if worst case scenario is the biggest thing To the Stars ever does is get the media to take it seriously, how is that not a win? I mean, that's a win in my book for sure. When I worked at the Eastern Chronicle, one of the things I did, I would run the website, and we would look at which stories click and, which stories work here and which stories that people are reading and which stories are the most newsworthy. And, I'll pitch this stuff sometimes. And a lot of times, even though people are interested in it, it's not going to do as well as a photo gallery of best places to go party. You know what I mean? So unfortunately, media nowadays is very ad-driven, money-driven. So it's kind of hard to get some of these harder news stories out there, especially when it comes to our topic. A great example is when I was at the Chronicle, we wanted to do something, a debate about Bigfoot, myself and the science writer, and we did it on like Google Hangouts. And at the end of it, one of the editors walked by in a gorilla suit, and it was kind of funny, but it's like, you're really going to take this serious debate and kind of make it a joke, So I mean, the attitudes have changed slightly, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And you make a good point in that. Look what articles have gotten out there. I mean, that's been my main focus over the years, is getting this information into mainstream media. And there's a way to do that. And, there's a high bar to reach as far as credibility and sources. And if you do that, though, you can get your articles out. I feel like I've been pretty successful. Some of our colleagues who we've had on, Tim McMillan, you've gotten mainstream media, and MJ Banias, another guy in the UFO Twitterverse, has been getting some articles in like Vice and I think in Vice. But there's a commonality between all of these, and that is backing up what you're saying with interviews from credible witnesses who have pertinent information, who have titles and backgrounds that are people that should be listened to. And that's the difference. Some random UFO guy out there writing something, like, for instance, the tabloid stuff, the Daily Express or Daily Star, they write this UFO guy who believes every single UFO video is a UFO, they include him. There's a total lack of credibility there, and it doesn't really move things forward. Whereas, a lot of what you're doing, that Tim and MJ and others are doing, I think are moving it forward and kind of opening up and massaging that journalism world. And even better, those skeptics who counter what they have to say are joining the conversation.
I think it's important because you need to have, in these articles, you need to have balance. You can't have a one-sided piece. I forgot what story it was. It was one of the New York Times stories, and they interviewed a skeptic, and the skeptic's point wasn't really good. So a lot of people bashed them for that, but they had to include some balance in there. And that's what I think we're seeing with some of the bigger outlets. They have higher editorial standards. So Popular Mechanics, Washington Post, New York Times, Vice, they have higher standards than the UFO world.com or something. You know what I mean? And that's not to take a shot at anyone, because a lot of the good work being done is by quote unquote citizen journalists. Absolutely. I think they're definitely helping move the ball forward too, but it's also, you also need the bigger outlets coming on board. And we've seen that, the fact that, the New York Times stories, that when they've done it, it's been some of their biggest stories. Ralph Blumenthal, who I talk to every time those stories comes out, I reach out to him, and he always says it blows up their emails and their comments, and so that says something, that these stories are very digestible to the audience.
Mm-hmm. And that, you bring up a good point, that the authors of the New York Times article, Ralph Blumenthal, like you just mentioned, Helene Cooper, she's more of just a Pentagon writer for the New York Times. That's why she was brought on the team. But the third being Leslie Kean. Leslie Kean has been writing UFO articles, very credible, great ones, for a very long time. They always are a hit and get tons. They make a lot of news and headlines. And the one thing she sticks to is sticking to credible sources. And she's got a great book. And in fact, there was just a interview with Harry Reid, Senator Harry Reid, recently, where he said, they asked him, you said there's so much to all this. What do you mean this is just the tip of the iceberg with UFOs? And he said, well, read Leslie Kean's books. They're very eye-opening, and they are. And her books include generals and military officials. She's very careful about who she selects to interview. And that rigor, that discipline is heavily rewarded with, New York Times best-selling books and tons of hits and getting into New York Times. So there's something to be said about that.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that that's the outlet she works for before writing the book lends her credibility, and that got her in the door to get some of those interviews, because that book is from military officials from all over the world. And I think a lot of people don't understand how big that was for her to kind of do that. But I'm a big fan of Leslie's. I met her last year and interviewed her, and I feature her a lot in my upcoming book because she's somebody who's also writing now about near-death experiences. And a lot of people in the UFO world for years have kind of seen, those commonalities. And, she's writing about something that to many is even more out there than UFOs. So it's, she's not afraid to kind of put her reputation on the line to write about something that may have a stigma against it, if that makes sense. So yeah, she's awesome.
Mm-hmm. UFOs on the Record is her book. There's kind of a subtitle that I always get wrong. UFOs on the Record.
It's so long.
Generals, military officials, something go on the record.
Yeah, go on there. Yeah.
I think I'm missing something. I always say,
yeah,
military guys and credible people go on the record. But here's another journalist that I didn't mention. And I love getting on the journalism topic because, first of all, I love these guys, but it's a lot of fun. So George Knapp, he's a Las Vegas writer for 8 News Now out there, KLAS. He's been writing for decades on UFOs. He's one of the most prolific, I think, mainstream investigative journalists that have covered the UFO topic. He's the guy, essentially, his reporting made Area 51 famous when he interviewed a alleged whistleblower that says he worked there and back engineered UFOs and aliens. And that's how we all came to know UFOs, or Area 51, and how Area 51 became at once the most popular base and the most secretive at the same time for a long time. So that's who George Knapp is. And he's been covering this topic because he's very close to Bob Bigelow, who's out in Las Vegas, who is the contractor that worked for the Pentagon investigating the UFOs and other paranormal stuff. He also, that's also where Senator Harry Reid is from, who started AATIP. And so he was close to him. So he's a guy in the mix, who's got all the answers out there. And he's been releasing information, leaks, and stuff about AATIP, really helpful and insightful. This person asked, Adrian, why is George Knapp interviewed extensively? It is clear as day that he has read the AATIP reports, but he says he is being patient. It has been a long time now. How patient does George plan to be? I think they're saying, why isn't George Knapp being interviewed more extensively? And there are some bureaucracy type things going on there. But what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think your introduction to him was perfect. And I think when it's all said and done, he's arguably going to be the most important UFO journalist of all time, I think, just because of what he's done his whole career. Absolutely. Regarding the being patient thing, I think a lot of that's not his decision to make. He works very closely with Bigelow and some of the To the Stars people, and those are his sources. Those are his sources for information. And if they don't want him running it, or if the editors say, you know what, let's not run this yet, then, he's basically handcuffed, and he's doing his due diligence as a journalist, respecting his sources and being patient. It's like, it's hard for us too, because we want it all now, especially how everything is nowadays. But it's like I said, we've gotten a lot. We are in the golden age of UFO news, and we've gotten so much. And even with George opening up Mystery Wire, the website that he's been doing, that's bringing back all these old articles and videos that he's done, like from the vault. I think that's super cool, because newer people, or even people like us, who didn't have the time to read all that, years ago, now it's up there for us. So I think everything George does is very important. I think, once again, we just have to be patient. I don't know how patient he plans to be, but this is probably something, it's not in his control.
That's, I think, the perfect answer. I think you're exactly right. That he doesn't always have permission. One of the reasons too, though, is that he works for CBS and KLAS. And why does that matter? It's because a lot of times, it has to be really big news for other networks to want to bring someone on, a reporter from a different network, because of course they want to feature their own writers and their own reporters. So that's definitely some of it. And then sometimes the networks will say, no, we don't want you going on that other network. You're our guy. So he's got to get permission from his own network. Plus, as an investigative journalist, this is one of the toughest jobs out there. You're busy. It's a busy, busy job. You get into work, it's boom, boom, boom. You've got to go investigate, go roll, interview, put together a package, a story and then get that out in time for the news. So it's also a tough job. So he's very, very busy. But otherwise, Yeah, he doesn't have permission. He wrote the book Skinwalker about the Skinwalker Ranch, and that's that mysterious ranch. There's a History Channel show on it right now. Actually, a lot of this original funding from the Pentagon was to investigate the alleged paranormal phenomena going on at the Skinwalker Ranch. But he said he had been asking Robert Bigelow, who is the owner of the ranch, to write that book for years, and kept being told no, no, no. He was in the loop. He knew what was going on, but they just didn't want that attention. So we had to wait to get permission in 2005. And then what was funny, he says, his book, I think, became a bestseller. And exactly what Bob Bigelow was afraid of happened. Then a bunch of people come trying to get onto this ranch, and it's private property. So, yeah, waiting. And Lou Elizondo has told us the same thing, that a lot of this information that's out there that he hints to, some of it isn't classified even, but that it's not his to release. He's got to wait. Now, he's not bound by anything but honor, really, Lou, but George is bound by, a rule with journalism where you don't release information before it's time. And if you do, you and I get that when we have an embargo, we're given information. Here's when you can write about it. If you break that, then your reputation's going to be bad. You're not going to get information from those sources anymore. And, it's not a good thing to do. They're trusting you with that information. So I think everybody feels, I certainly feel your frustration, Adrian, because, I talk with George a lot. And fortunately, I get a little more hints at some of that information that can't be shared. Maybe even some of the information that can't, but only a little bit compared to what he's got, I know. And he tells me the same thing all the time. He just can't wait. He's hoping time seems to be soon where he can release some more. So he waits for those windows of opportunity to release information, and hopefully there'll be another one coming soon. We'll see. Do you have any inkling of, or hopes as to where direction that information might go?
I have no idea. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard to call. Your guess is as good as mine, even though there's potentially different, avenues that can go down. But like I said, we just have to be patient. We can't expect, these mainstream journalists to go rogue, and put everything on the line just to appease a small set of people, on the internet. We can't do that. I think that's irrational.
All right, just commenting to a couple of people. Brian Collins had written that the name of the book is UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. Sorry, Leslie. I know that she would not be happy if I forget that too, which I always do. Other questions. So here's kind of some just general questions, general UFO questions that people ask often. Here's one. Why are all videos blurry? UFO videos and pictures blurry. Do you have an idea?
Yeah. So I dabble a little bit in photography. Like, I'm not a photographer. I know how to take like contra photography. Like when I used to go cover shows, the Chronicle, I would shoot my own photos. And when I teach kids, I teach them just like the very basics of cameras. I mean, even if you go outside right now and try to take a picture of an airplane with your cell phone, even with the most expensive camera, you're going to lose resolution just by how far it is. So I think right there is your answer in terms of why they're blurry.
Yeah, I mean, the cameras, especially your phone or most cameras, you've got to have a really good zoom lens to get close. And then lights at night are also a really tough one, because I get those quite a bit where someone says, this thing did all this incredible stuff. Here's a picture of it. And all it is a light in the sky. And, there's nothing you can do with that.
Yeah, even trying to take pictures of stars at night. Good luck.
And, this also comes back to the Nimitz incident, for instance. So, and someone did ask us to talk about that. So we'll kind of segue into that as well. I'll bring up that question in a minute. But he was asking us to talk about, David Fravor and the Nimitz incident. Well, in that, David Fravor was a wing commander. So he's the top guy on this aircraft carrier as far as pilots go. He was zeroed in to look at this unidentified object that they were capturing on radar back in 2005. And off the coast of San Diego, right where I am, pretty close to here. And he saw the giant white tic-tac object at 40 feet long. It was over a disturbance in the water. He went in to go chase it. He got in a little bit of a maneuver with it, and then it took off at an incredible speed. But the video that was captured for that incident was later in the day, and that's one of these Navy videos that was released recently. But the video there's not much information you can get from any of those Navy videos because there's, first of all, information we have missing. And the hard part with video or photos is they are often, with these sort of situations, kind of supplemental, but they offer very little to no data about the actual incident. So really, to Nimitz or any of these cases, the FLIR video is interesting, especially because these pilots were there and they're expert witnesses who can say, you know, this is what I saw this thing doing when I caught it on camera or before I caught it on camera. But the most important part of that is the expert witness testimony, not the videos themselves, typically.
Absolutely. And that's, you know, when you're doing a story, I always go with getting quotes and getting interviews and testimonies. So a lot of times you can't just rely on the video, but when you have the video and then you have, in this case, this is truly expert testimony as well. And eyewitnesses, professional eyewitnesses too. I think that only helps make the story stronger for sure.
Yeah, here's the guy. Here's another question about that case too. He says he watched Unidentified, and one thing bothered him was that the people who came out in the 2004, I mixed it up, Tic-Tac Incident, 2004 is correct, I think, said some people dressed black got all the communication that happened in the ship. Not all the communication, but yeah, some of the witnesses say some people did come and confiscate some of that material.
I think Patrick Hughes, was one of the people who said that. I've interviewed him on my website. I think he was the one who said some of the radar data was taken. I think that's what he could be referencing too.
Mm-hmm. So, and then one of the other people mentioned, you know, David Fravers being on Joe Rogan.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe Rogan's kind of shown an interest in this stuff. But I think, again, that I guess goes back to our earlier point that Fravor is a guy with an extremely high amount of credibility, not just being a jet fighter pilot, but being a wing commander in charge of an entire wing of jet fighters. And he has been, you know, unequivocal. He's been and is stating that this occurred. This object was crazy. He had, in an interview, said that he felt that the object could have been ours, but that he felt that at the time, you know, it could have been some super extremely high-tech thing. He said, I didn't know whose it was. All I knew was I wanted to fly it, actually, was one of the quotes he made that I love. But that as the years went on and the technology related to this never released, and he really never heard much about it, even though the idea, the Tic-Tac UFO became a thing in the Navy, people would talk about it, that began to convince him that this was not ours. And at this point, he does not believe that that was any, you know, at least U.S. made, if not human made, technology that he experienced.
Yeah, and other people have said the same thing. So people, you know, obviously other people who work for To the Stars, and you know, like Steve Justice, who worked for Skunkworks as well. So it's, you know, you're getting it from multiple experts, expert analysis, who are saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Here's another interesting question that I'd like to hear your opinion. Another one from Brian Drummond about George Knapp. Knapp is obviously an advocate of the Bob Lazar story. What do you think of the idea that Lazar's story was a misinformation campaign against foreign countries, throwing them off, making them waste resources, analyzing false info, etc., etc.? And just for some background, Bob Lazar is that witness who says that he worked at Area 51 back engineering, you know, alien spacecraft. And he sticks to that story this day. In fact, George Knapp has worked with filmmaker
Jeremy.
Yeah, Jeremy Corbell, and who we wrote quite a bit about with Den of Geek. And So that is a tough one. I mean, do you think, because Bob Lazar doesn't really have anybody corroborating his information. It's just one guy making these claims. We have no more evidence now, decades later, than we did when he originally came out. So a lot of people ask this: is this a disinformation campaign by the government? And Bob Lazar has answered that question, and he thinks that's absolutely ridiculous because there's no evidence of that, and that would just be speculative. True, but there's no evidence of what he's talking about either.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never heard that theory that Lazar's case was a misinformation campaign to throw off other governments. I never heard that before.
Yeah, me either.
That's new to me, but it's, for me, Lazar's case, you're right, it's really interesting because there's really no one to corroborate his story. But if he was to come out and say what he said, I think there would obviously be a blowback of people not wanting to corroborate it. I mean, if you kind of if you compare his, I mean, it's like apples and oranges, but when Lou Elizondo said there's going to be people who are uncomfortable with what I'm saying and may try to discredit me. So, I mean, Lazar's case could be something similar, where people are trying to discredit who he is and who he was and what he claims he's done and seen. For sure, that could be the case.
Yeah, one tough part with Bob Lazar, of course, his claims are, pretty wild. But also his educational background is in question, because no one's been able to verify that he had the degrees that he claims to have. And that's a really tough one for him too.
I think that's the toughest one for sure, I think.
Right. This is really interesting, and I love this question because I think that this is kind of something that gets lost in the mix too. This probably will be our last question because I want to talk about your book, upcoming book before we're done. But he says, Luis Elizondo has made it clear that he was opposed in the Pentagon by a cohort of Christians. George Knapp said it too. Why would Christians do that?
It's a great question, and it kind of goes to the idea of the Collins elite, which is a group in the government that pushed this idea that UFOs and aliens were demonic. And I think it's I think this idea goes grander than just our government. I think there's a lot of governments around the world that are afraid of the religious ramifications. But to me, I mean, I'm someone who studies some of the paranormal aspects of this too, and I don't think it's disqualifying religion. If anything, in some cases, it may prove some cases, if that makes sense too, some of the stories. But it does not surprise me at all that there be Christians in our government who would not want this out there. I mean, you look at the stuff that they block regularly, things that regard, even human rights to some degree. I'm not trying to make a political point, but for sure, the idea of them wanting to block, information about UFOs, that does not sound like something that's out there at all. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny. There's some comments. One guy says, because if UFOs are real, then Jesus isn't. Someone says, religious ramifications, as if we're back in 1386. And that's why I think this question's really interesting, because it's true. Not only did it was actually before Elizondo's program, AATIP, the New York Times, the $20 million that the New York Times said this group got actually went to the founding program, which was called AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Analysis Program, I think it was. And they got the 20 million because they were investigating Skinwalker that we were talking about earlier and all the different paranormal phenomena going on there. Well, immediately, these religious guys, these kind of evangelicals in the government were like, no, this is like demonic. We can't get involved with this. It's too scary. It's related to the devil. And got that part squashed, and the only part that survived was just, Lou was like, okay, we'll just cover UFO military cases. That's it. We'll not do the rest, and hopefully those guys will leave us alone. And that worked. Some of the people who worked with Bigelow and on AATIP, like Hal Puthoff, worked on remote viewing back in the 70s. And for a long time, we had essentially these psychic spies. This is a real program. A lot of law enforcement were using these guys. They lasted through something like 3 administrations, busy the whole time, psychically getting information for law enforcement. And they got shut down. That program got shut down for the same reason. These kind of religious evangelicals who were like, this is demonic. We can't do this. So that's why I love this aspect of the story, is that it's so strange. It's that these evangelicals have such a strong influence and that, to this day, it's like, back in, like somebody said, 1386, where they're having this huge influence on what the government and the military is doing based off of these kind of these ideas, which is pretty odd.
And if you look at it, I mean, I think that comes to a lot of people, I mean, just being culturally unaware of how other cultures perceive things. And I think that that's a big issue here. That's something that, in my studies and especially some of the research I did for my book, there's things I learned about how other cultures perceive different paranormal experiences. And absolutely, a Christian may view this as demonic, and another religion or culture may view it another way. But it's funny because you're seeing, the Christians in power automatically go straight there. Oh, this is how we perceive it. This is it. So I think that's a cultural divide that a lot of people can't get past as well. And I just want to mention, you mentioned earlier too, the remote viewing experiments and all these things that really sound like, that they're out there. And I've seen some of the evidence of the experiments. Like I did a story this year that Rice University is housing all these documents. And when I went to go do the story, I got to look through some of it. It's amazing. Like I could have spent all day there, but they have like the scientific data that they use to study these experiments, and I was able to see some of them and look at them. And I couldn't read all of them because I and understand the terminology or the what they had set up, but it's still it's there. Like they did these experiments, so somebody in power believed that this could be done.
And pretty extraordinary, fascinating history of this stuff, and all of it's so weird and things that you would never imagine. Who would have known that evangelicals of all people would get these programs shut down? But your book, you mentioned your book. So what's your new book about? What's it going to include? What's it called?
So that's a perfect segue. This is what we're talking about. We're just talking about just kind of like the weirder aspects of it. So it's Punk Rock and UFOs, Stranger Than Fiction is the name of the book. And, I didn't want to write a traditional UFO book because I think the more we study this, the more I think people are starting to kind of look at the more paranormal aspects of it, or just kind of get away from the more nuts and bolts approach. And through my reading, my research, I started looking at, I started thinking about kind of what we perceive as fiction and nonfiction, and how the lines have been blurred basically throughout history, through fairy tales, pop culture, movies, Hollywood, you name it. And the purpose of the book is to kind of normalize the idea of paranormal. I'm not saying that this is 100% true or this is real and this isn't. I just want to normalize it so the average person will read this and then they watch Stranger Things and they go, oh, this was based on something. Or, they pick up a comic book, and they say, oh, wow, something like this really happened at some point, or this character is based off this god. And that's, one of the things I really wanted to get through. So the book, I've interviewed a lot of scholars and scientists in it, as well as people who work in pop culture. And I definitely use everything, regarding the Tic-Tac Incident as a big example of something that's stranger than fiction. I've interviewed some of the witnesses, and I got a quote from Tom DeLonge for the book as well regarding what they're doing with secret machines, how it really reflects that, because a lot of criticism was like, oh, they're trying to blur the lines by doing a fictional series and a non-fictional. And it's like, this was happening for hundreds of years now. The lines have been crossed. So if anything, the book is really trying to normalize paranormal. If my second book, True Believers, was trying to really reach out to the average person and say, hey, look, this is why you should be interested in this stuff. This book is more to try to pull the average person in and say, hey, look, the paranormal isn't all that weird. You're one of the quotes I love, it's from Professor Jeffrey Kripal, who I think is a very underrated person when it comes to UFO field. But he's written so many great books. He's a friend of mine. He's amazing. And he says, one of his quotes is, the Bible is full of what we would consider paranormal stories. It is true. So, yeah, that's what the book's about. It's called Stranger Than Fiction. It comes out next Tuesday on Amazon and Barnes & Noble online. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely be sharing that. You'll be tweeting that. And just Mike, your Twitter, by the way, is just at Mike Damante, right? Your name, which people can see there on the screen. And your website, like you have there on the screen too, punkrockinufos.com, where they can find more about you, your books, and read more of your articles, which I would highly recommend everybody go subscribe to his Twitter right now, because just really, really good stuff coming out there. I think, Mike, you've been sharing some of the best stuff out there. So thanks so much for coming on and answering questions. We got some great questions too, I thought.
We did. Thank you, Alejandro, so much for having me again. And you're one of the people I respect, and it's we've communicated for the past couple of years, and I consider you a friend. So it's really appreciate you having me on to talk about all these things, because sometimes talking about this stuff gets kind of boring, but when you talk about it with somebody who's passionate, when we get really good questions too, it really kind of invigorates the spirit and stuff. So yeah, man, I really appreciate it. Thank you for letting me talk about the book as well, and everything I've been writing about lately too. So thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to all you who have been watching. The questions were really great. Thank you so much. Definitely follow us on Den of Geek. You know what? I'll go find an article I have too on Den of Geek about Tom DeLonge and kind of the history of how he started all and made all this happen. So you can check that out. But follow Den of Geek on Twitter also. They're at Den of Geek US. I'm at Alejandro T. Rojas. And also be sure, if you're watching on Facebook, to like the Den of Geek page, or if you're on YouTube, to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of these videos. Den of Geek always has lots of really cool stuff coming. And of course, if you're a sci-fi geek like many of us UFO geeks are, then you're going to really appreciate all of that content as well. But otherwise, thank you guys all so much for joining us. I guess until next time, we'll see you later.
Thank you.